welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. As you can probably tell from background noise, we are once again doing a car podcast. Jacob and I are driving to an event that we're going to be judging at together, and so we are going to be spending some of the time in the conversation talking to you about 2019 and all the great things that happened in 2019 and what we sort of think of as looking back on the best ethical questions, best ethical ideas, and questions we wish we talked about more. So, Jacob, how are you doing today?
Oh, well, the weather is not the best right now, and I am the designated driver. Not that Matthew's been drinking, but that the road is such that I may as well be drinking. We're in freezing rain right now, so if there's an abrupt pause in the flow, it's because I'm trying not to kill us both.
Yes. Hopefully you won't have to listen to oh God, we're going to die, followed by a crashing noise. But then if that happened, we probably wouldn't upload the podcast, so I'm not going to worry about it. Anyway, on that cheery note, as I said, 2019 was pretty an awesome year. And Jacob, let me just start with there. Like, before we get into kind of what are our picks for the top 5 and different questions, what's kind of your overall thought of 2019 as a year of geek media and the questions and ethical discussions that it presented to us?
Well, 2019 gave us some culminations of some sort of geeky franchises that we were very into. So it's a very important year for that. It also gave gave me specifically a brand new interest that I got to bring to the podcast and talk about.
Wrestling!
My own soap operas. I now watch soap operas that have a bunch of fighting for some reason in them, and it's super cool and also super problematic a lot of the time. So like for me personally, because of my interest expanding, 2019 was an interesting year, but also just in terms of the kinds of properties that either started up or that we got brand new, or that finished off in the year that had been culminating over time. We had I'm just going to say it, Avengers Endgame happened this year. That was a big wrap-up to something we talked about a lot. The Netflix MCU got shot in the knee until dead. So that's a thing that happened. And we got Jessica Jones Season 3.
Yep.
Have we talked about Jessica Jones Season 3 yet?
I think a little bit. I think we didn't. I was looking back.
Done an episode on that?
Both Jessica Jones Season 3 and Daredevil Season 3 are things we did not cover as much as I would have liked.
Yeah, alright. So, something to talk about. A lot happened in 2019.
And on kind of a similar note, yeah, I definitely feel that, as well as the other big thing that got wrapped up, which we had our last episode was about. And I know for me, it was honestly a big part of inspiring me to do these kind of questions, and that was Star Wars. The wrap-up of the Star Wars story. So yeah, to me, 2019 was really about a year of endings and of new beginnings. And I think a lot of what I'm thinking about in 2020 is where are we going with some of these properties? What's going to happen going forward? And, what's all that going to look like? So with that, let's start with best media properties for the year. And to be clear, here I think we're not just talking about what we think were just like the best, most enjoyable, like well-made movies or TV shows or whatever, but the ones that we think like kind of raise the best questions or the most enjoyable. Given the nerds that we are about this stuff, those are probably pretty similar lists, because I think a lot of our enjoyment of these things, certainly for me, is what are the things that really make me think. But for anyone who wants to be like, oh no, this property was better than that one, that's not quite the rubric we're using. And I'll start with my number 5, which is one I know you haven't seen, and I hope you will at some point, because I would love to talk about it with you, and it's The Boys. The Boys is an Amazon show. It kind of refreshingly, it is a superhero TV show that is not DC or Marvel. I actually think it's a completely original property, although it may have been an independent comic book, and if a listener knows, please let us know. But it did something really, really interesting that I don't see enough happen with, which is that, so many of the properties we look at start with the conceit of superheroes exist, but in secret, and so no one really knows, and so the world is kind of the way the world is. And this one really goes into the idea of not only do superheroes exist, but our society and our economy has kind of been built around them. And I won't spoil too much, but I'll just say, like, a lot of what it gets into is what would corporate America do in terms of once superheroes exist and now can market cereal, and stuff like that. And what happens when, in a lot of ways, it's very intentionally a commentary on professional athletics, because it's also about, what happens when the superhero who everyone loves and is a great guy actually does terrible things to his spouse or stuff like that. So it's a very unique take on superhero stories that I'm really hoping gets more talked about, because I really like the way it approached those issues in 2019.
I really want to see The Boys, as has been discussed multiple times on this podcast. My timing for media consumption is limited.
Yeah.
And so I have been, although I do have a confession to make, and it's part of my honorable mentions. I have taken a large chunk of my media consumption time and chosen to do something with it that is largely just like popcorn for me. In the Great British Bake Off. Come on, I love baking.
It's a good one.
I love cooking, and I love the very wholesome approach to a competition.
Yeah.
Where it's not, like, it is, but it isn't. Except for when Paul Hollywood is quite literally Hollywooding at contestants.
Well, and I think I saw it on your honorable mentions, and it's one I think it'd be fun to maybe do something about reality shows.
Yeah,
because
for sure.
I think there's a lot of ethical questions that come up with those. I'll also say, yeah, it has always been a thing of this podcast that I have a lot more time to watch things than Jacob does. Jacob is, unlike, I have evolved to a state beyond capitalism, but Jacob still has one of those job things, which he thinks is more important than watching TV shows for our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
In actuality, I work from home, and I do consulting work, and I just get to watch TV while I work, but I like to twist Jacob's tail a little bit about it from time to time.
To be fair, I also have moved from pre-2019 Jacob, who watched 0 hours of professional wrestling every week, to 2019 and beyond Jacob, who is watching something to the tune of 3 to 4 hours of professional wrestling every week. And that's a pretty big chunk of media consumption all of a sudden that I'm doing.
And as we'll get to, I am guilty in a similar way, which is that I have now, and granted, this is because my partner and I got something wonderful, but in the last 2 weeks, I have moved from 0 hours a week of playing video games to 12 to 15 hours a week of playing video games.
One of us.
I will make a quick plug that the game Divinity Co-op, it allows 2 people to play together in a really great RPG system. But anyway, pulling us back to our ideas, and we're going to get to the video game point later. And just for our listeners' understanding, normally Jacob would read off his list. We decided that perhaps having him read off a list while driving a car would perhaps not be the safest thing, so I'm going to read his list. But I did not look at his list until after I'd made mine.
Right.
So Jacob, number 5 on your list is A Series of Unfortunate Events, which did just slip under the wire for 2019.
It snuck in there for being a 2019 thing because the last episode, the last Series of Unfortunate Events that we ever got was at the start of the new year. So I get to count it for 2019.
Well, and you do, because one of my honorable mentions is at the other end. So, but yeah, why is that one of your top ones?
So, A Series of Unfortunate Events, and I brought this up in one of our previous top 5 lists for a best characters in Violet Beauregard, Violet Baudelaire, as a character I really appreciated. The property, the story of A Series of Unfortunate Events is just so charming, in that it takes a literal tragic story and tells it to you in a very enjoyable way. And I find it interesting that it is very much a morality play, but it is one where at the very end, I mean, do you mind spoilers for...
No, go ahead.
So mild spoilers for Series of Unfortunate Events. If you plan to watch it, skip ahead 15 minutes. I'll probably be done by then and then back up. But It's hopefully a lot less than that. It's one of the things that happens in the very last story they tell you is that this person who has been hounding these children, making their lives miserable constantly by trying to seek their fortune, ends up fatally wounded with them on a deserted island. And all they have to do to make that problem of him go away is nothing. And they choose instead to go out of their way and hinder their own ability to escape from their predicament in order to try to save his life. It doesn't work.
Right.
And he talks them. He basically tries to talk them out of it. But they end up in a position of understanding who Count Olaf was, and that he wasn't just a mustache twirling villain, but he was somebody who came from a position of being really damaged and really hurt.
Yeah.
And so they don't save him, but they understand who he was as a person and get to a place of at least being able to forgive him for some of what he did, but not redeem him for it. It's a very heartwarming, I feel, position to be in, to be able to be like, you were a shitty person to us, and we can understand why, because now we know the full story of you.
Right.
And so, while we don't really want to, we're not going to forget what you did to us, but at a certain point, you're not going to be around anymore.
Right.
And I think that, we can have sympathy for you. We can have empathy for your position, because it's not like you were a good person who suddenly started doing bad for no reason.
Yeah, and that makes me want to watch it, especially because that dovetails nicely with what is one of my honorable mentions, which in many ways I put in a very similar category to The Boys, which is The Umbrella Academy.
Yeah, The Umbrella Academy is another thing I intend to watch.
It is very good, and it's in the way that The Boys really explores what happens to society when you have superheroes. The Umbrella Academy really explores what happens psychologically to the individual people, and one of the things that it really does is that same kind of idea of a lot of the conflict that's happening is because all of these people think they had very similar experiences, but actually had very different ones and are not understanding each other's pain. So yeah, that's definitely one that I really want to hear more about. And I know the second, number 4 on your list, also one I haven't, actually number 4 on your list was one I did see, Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
So I had it as an honorable mention. I didn't think it was quite as good as you, but I didn't put it quite high. But what for you made it put it on the list?
So, in full disclosure, Avengers Endgame is not in my top 5. It got an honorable mention instead. I had to put Captain Marvel over the top for one specific moment in the movie.
I think, can I try and guess what it is?
Absolutely, go for it.
I think it's going to be the one where Captain Marvel is confronting the guy who has been kind of mansplaining and being her mentor and holding her back the whole time. And he kind of demands that she fights him on his terms.
And she's just pastes him up against a fucking mountain.
Yeah.
And it's the most wonderful moment in all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Fight me IRL. That was so incredible for so many reasons. I love that they were true to the fictional hero of Captain Marvel and gave us a strong female lead in a movie that I think holds up regardless of your opinions about the Marvel properties and their adaptation into film. It's just a good Marvel movie.
Yeah.
And one of the best they've made, and it just happened to be a woman in the lead role, and I think it's so important that happened. And that scene, to me, was the pinnacle of, this is something that we would applaud in the theater at any point if it were done by a male character, and so therefore to have it be done by Captain Marvel was, I feel, very important. And I don't want to oversell this, because I'm not a woman, I can't speak from that perspective, but I just loved that movie to pieces, and loved that scene especially, because it took everything that would, if that movie, I feel, had been made 2 years ago, that scene would have broken with her having something to prove to him.
Yeah.
She's got absolutely fuck all to prove to that person who was oppressing her and telling her that, like, her powers were a problem or what the fuck ever. Like, no,
Yeah,
get busted.
I definitely agree with you, and I think in many ways, I think it's a example of how this year was an embarrassment of riches. Because I think it is not that I have anything against Captain Marvel. I think it's a fantastic movie. We just had so many good things that I couldn't quite find a way to get in my top 5. But I think you're right, and for me, there's 2 really things ethically that really stand out. One is that particular scene, but also just her whole development as a character. And I do think that you and I don't know the woman experience, but certainly I made a point, and I think you did the same, to read a lot of women commentators about this. And so many of them talked about that scene and just talked about the whole idea of her being a character who doesn't have to define herself on the terms that a man sets for her. And just how important that was. And I feel like we saw that in part just in the reaction to the movie, where so many of the men said, so many of the men who didn't like the movie said, well, but she didn't have a character arc. And I loved the pieces that people wrote in response to that. Some, really trying to painstakingly educate, some hilariously taking people to task, all of which is valid. But the core of it all being, you don't think she has a character arc because you have no idea what she's overcoming. And that in many ways and again, it's not something I completely understand, but I can't relate to, but I think I can try and understand of just her character, fighting through those things and having to be defined on men's terms, that there is an incredible character arc that she has there, but you have to understand it to see it. And the other thing that I think the movie brought up that was so great was really the whole idea of who the villain is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to basically say this episode, we're going to pretty much spoil everything that was great in 2019. But spoilers for Captain Marvel, the big reveal of the people we thought were the enemies are
so good. Refugees.
Yeah.
And they are the oppressed. And they look, quote unquote, look evil.
Right, well, but because to me, it's the fact that they were oppressed, but that they don't go to therefore they are pure and good and wonderful. And that their leader flat out says, our hands are pretty dirty too. I thought that was just such a nice moment. So yeah, it's not in my top 5, but it's certainly up there. My number 4, I know another one you haven't seen, and so I'm going to be a little briefer about these, just so we don't go too deep on all these, but it's The Mandalorian. It's not the most complex ethical show, and in many ways my love of it is more about my love of Star Wars in general, but I think part of what I loved about it, yes, Baby Yoda is adorable, and it's great. And it does there are some very good ethical questions it raises, especially about PTSD after war, and about, how do you transition from a war mentality to a peacetime mentality. But I also just love the fact that it gets into questions of loyalty and things like that. And as well as, and this isn't kind of a larger ethical issue, it fleshes out the Star Wars world in a way that I really appreciate. And that I think, if we get a chance to discuss it, it's really going to be a great one to get into. Going further along, my number 3 was Good Omens. I think this was on your honorable mentions, am I right? Or did I?
No, I haven't seen Good Omens yet.
Okay.
My in-laws have it available for us to watch whenever we want, and I haven't yet. And I am very upset because I know I'm going to love the piss out of it. But
and it's again, it comes off as just lighter, really good humor and parody. But there's actually, have you read the book?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so then I won't spoil the plot.
I had so Larissa read the book to me because that was a romantic thing we used to do.
Oh, that's really sweet.
Very often. We just don't have the time for it anymore because # working professionals.
But so like the entire plot is an ethical question.
Yeah.
It's about how much do you stay with your team versus recognizing the problems in your team, and how much what is the difference between winning versus surviving, and the ability to step out of a conflict mentality. So, it I think was, in some ways, I think it's one of the best examples of an ethical thing because you could miss the fact that it's teaching you ethics.
Good Omens is a great story And if the adaptation is at all faithful to the book, then it belongs on this list.
So your number 3 was All Elite Wrestling.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about wrestling some more. All Elite Wrestling is on here specifically because as a consumer of professional wrestling now, there was an issue we talked about it on the podcast, where sometimes the big name in the industry, the WWE, has some problems. Like the Blood Money Saudi Arabia show, the Crown Jewel, I think is the name for it. I try not to pay attention enough to it to even remember that.
Yeah.
But like garbage like that, and like more recently, there's been this like ridiculous cuck storyline with one of their characters that's really racist and awful and terrible and sexist and but that was it. If you wanted to watch a really good product, most of the time well-made product, you had to deal with all of the WWE's baggage. All Elite Wrestling has provided an alternative it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
They're highlighting different things, but they're doing a lot that I like, and so like it's on my list because they're not perfect either.
Yep.
And I'm going to talk about their women's division of it later as something that I'm looking forward to them fixing. But it's so important to have competition that can challenge something in social awareness, the way that AEW has been trying to challenge the WWE.
And that for me is great to hear, because I remember we got to the end of our episode on the ethics of wrestling, and I kind of felt like we convinced everyone to stop watching wrestling. And I remember thinking I was confused when you said that you were still following it. And so that makes a lot of sense. I think it's actually a really interesting commentary on what's been an overall theme for us since we began, but especially this year, which is how you deal with problematic favorites. So
right.
I really appreciate that one. So that's your number 3, and then I just want to kind of hurry us along because we have not too much time.
We have a lot to talk about,
So number 2, Knives Out. You want to quickly say why you like that one?
So you have an earlier printing of this. I changed that. Knives
Sure.
Out has actually been relegated to an honorable mention. Real quick, great whodunit. I haven't seen a whodunit like this in a long time. That's fun in the way that Clue was fun.
Nice.
If you enjoyed Clue with Tim Curry and Leslie Ann Warren and highly recommend seeing this movie. I want to change this to Taz Amnesty, the Adventure Zone Amnesty.
Oh, okay.
So this wrapped
Holding
up
podcast is a veritable art form. I can appreciate that.
This wrapped up this year. This arc wrapped up this year, and the theme of the story is dealing with something trying to force you to, as a culture, into like a conflict-based thing, and judging you on whether or not you were still a culture that needed conflict to survive and thrive, and like, so it's like this whole like really judgy extra-dimensional entity thing that is trying to control societies based on what they think the epitome of a society was.
Oh, fascinating.
And our main characters effectively rebelling against that when they find out that's what's going on. It's beautiful.
Well, that makes me something I want to tune into. And it also, if the whole point of this podcast originally was to focus on the idea that you can raise ethical questions in media that people often don't think about that. We started it as comic books and TV and movies, and so now the idea that people are approaching those things through things like podcasts and D&D campaigns is just amazing to me.
And it got there. This is the wild spark. Just real briefly.
Yeah.
This is the wild spark. It got there from the premise of let's make a show. Let's make a story that's like a show like Supernatural. It's like a Monster of the Week type show, and that's the story arc that Griffin McElroy crafted, and that's the kind of thing that you can do with these pieces, folks. It's wonderful.
So my number 2, I think you haven't seen it yet, but maybe you have. It's Spider-Man: Far From Home.
I still haven't seen Far From Home,
and it's not perfect. I don't think it's quite as good as the first Spider-Man movie, but it is very, very good. But the thing that puts it on the map for me is I love repercussions. We've talked about that a lot. And it does a very interesting job of telling us what happened to the world after Infinity War, and what are all the little ways that having 5 years of half the people blinking out and half the people not, what did that do to people? And it's just, and I'm not going to say anything more because I don't want to spoil things, but it is a very, very good exploration of that. And the thing that it really explores is what is my number one, which is your honorable mention, I know, which is Endgame. And I think Endgame is on there for me, especially because, and I mentioned this later, I am, one of the things that I'm most fascinated by is the difference between revenge versus justice, or revenge versus solving a problem. And my single favorite moment in the Endgame movie is when they have the power to kill Thanos, they kill Thanos, and they realize that it doesn't make them feel any better. And I just, I once heard an incredible speech by, I was at a vigil at a prison where an execution was about to happen. And it was a speech by a death row, by a person who was against the death penalty. And he had a son who was murdered. And he pushed very hard for the person who killed his son to be executed. And he gave this heart-wrenching story about how he watched the person who had killed his son be executed. And the next morning he woke up and his son was still dead, and he still felt terrible about it. And it was just this incredible moment for him of, and that's what Endgame for me really hit. That's why it's, and partially also it's because it was the culmination of so many questions, and we did a whole episode on Endgame. We talked about it already, but it to me was just my number one. And your number one was The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance.
Yeah. So if you weren't aware of this, Dark Crystal's back as a television series that is a prequel to the movies, or the movie,
right.
Singular. It's on here partly for enjoyment purposes because I love practical effects in this day and age, because when they're well done, they're really well done.
And this is actual puppets, not CGI.
And nobody does practical effects like Henson's shop does practical effects. This wants to take $290.
I'm pointing out an exit.
I'll
just, while Jacob's trying to navigate the road, I would just say I have not gotten to see it. I've only seen 1 or 2 episodes, and I was having trouble following it. I want to be able to give it more attention because it looks like it's going to be great, and also raise some really great questions.
So there is there are a couple of things about it that really make it hit my list, and a big one is actually the character of the Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Because at one point are they also trying? Yes, they are. I'm gonna let them because I did a whole bunch of garbage.
Sure.
Getting over. So the character of the Chamberlain at one point has an exchange with one of our protagonists. The Chamberlain is one of the villains, but he actually kind of makes a point insofar as, hey, like, if you're basically our food and what sustains us, is it really amoral for us to eat you any more than it is for you than it is amoral for you to eat the things that you eat,
right?
The life that you consume, and it's just it was a challenging question I hadn't expected them to raise,
right? Well, especially because as much as I love Dark Crystal, the movie, the original, the villains in it are complete mustache twirlers.
Oh, for sure. The Skeksis are... Yeah. And, they're mostly that, but...
Yeah, no, it sounds like a really interesting, fun thing to get into. I will... so I'll just go over now my honorable mentions so we can move on to the next question while Jacob's, again, navigating a toll booth. But for me, I mentioned Captain Marvel. My other ones quickly were Cloak and Dagger Season 2. Again, just a very, very good show. There's been a couple of TV shows, and I'll talk about a few of them later in this podcast, that were kind of outside of the, either Netflix MCU or things like that, but there were Marvel shows, and we're still not clear how they fit into the larger universe, but really just did great things and great ethical questions. Cloak and Dagger is definitely one of them. She-Ra is another one that's on my list. She-Ra has blown me away because it is showing me what children's education can do and children's animation in a way that is, like, I never got to Steven Universe, but I know a lot of people love it. She-Ra has the Muppets quality of being good for kids, but also great for adults. And the degree to which it does representation of having people of all body sizes and of all sexualities and have various gender identities and have different disabilities, and it just blows me away. It's one I hope we get to talk about. And the last one, and this is my answer to your unfortunate events, because it just snuck under 2019 from the other direction, is The Witcher. I have only seen the first episode of The Witcher, and already I think it might be the most ethically challenging thing I watched in 2019. Or actually, I watched it in 2020, but it came out in 2019. So those are my honorable mentions. And Jake was just to review Avengers Endgame and Great British Bake Off.
And Knives Out.
Yeah. So now let's go on to our next question, which is the favorite ethical questions of 2019. And so my number 5 was problematic favorites. And we did our episode on that pretty recently. We've talked about it a lot. I'm not going to go into it, but I think it's one that's going to come up a lot more, especially with the Black Widow movie, which I admit I'm still not sure if I'm going to see. Because part of me wants to give my dollars to any woman-led superhero thing I can. Part of me really doesn't want to give my dollars to Scarlett Johansson. So I think problematic favorites is going to be a big one in this coming year.
That's higher on my list if I recall my list correctly, because that was one of, if not my favorite topic of the year for how much it challenged us, specifically as the hosts of this podcast, where we consume media and claim to like media, and sometimes there's stuff in there that is not great. J.K. Rowling has taken a turn for the even worse and more obvious.
Yeah, since we did that episode. And I'll say also, Jacob and I had slightly different approaches to this question. I just went on questions. Jacob actually went on the episodes that we discussed these on.
Yes.
Which is probably a better way to answer it. But so, Jacob, your number 5 was paternal ethics. And what was that for you?
So that was when we talked about, like, John Winchester, Tony Stark.
Yeah.
Father figures and the role of the paternal figure or mentors, really, in hero stories and their development and how they choose to interact with their progeny. That was another Car Talk episode.
Yeah.
But it was one where I really feel like we got into some meat on some issues, and it's still something that I feel very strongly about, because it was another one where there was some nuance that we recognized, where, like, it's not like I'm a huge fan of the whole tough love idea, but there sometimes certain approaches will not work, and like also recognizing that, like, holding parents or mentors to impossible standards is also not correct. They're also human, right? And allowing them to be human in our stories is very important, or else we get characters like Gandalf that are like. I love the character of Gandalf, but
Gandalf it has a great beard and is a great Mary Sue. Marvin Stewart, I think maybe.
Gary Stu.
Gary Stu, there we go. So your number 4 was Anger and Power.
Yeah.
Which I also think was a very good one.
Like, in retrospect, might deserve to be higher on my list because it's something that, like, it's very personally for me. Given some issues with my life experience and the people I've interacted with. I have to make a turn here.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think, like I was just talking about the revenge thing from Endgame. It's the idea of how you use anger and how you use power, especially as a hero when you're trying to do the right thing. It's one that just comes up all the time.
Right. We talked about the Luke Cage moment. We talked about what happens when our heroes let their anger get the better of them, and how that can be a real issue. And then we talked about the Hulk and how, I think at that time we hadn't seen Endgame yet.
Yeah.
So we hadn't seen that beautiful, sort of end, if you will, of the Hulk's heroic journey of learning how to deal with his anger not as
a binary.
Yeah, exactly. And just being able to accept himself as a person, and how that actually helps him manage his anger better.
And it's one I'm sure is going to keep coming up. Number 4 is one we never really got into in a full episode, although it danced around a lot of our discussions, and certainly was one I discussed a lot online. And then I think we're going to be discussing a lot more. And it's the corporate aspect of all of this. And what I mean by that is the fact that a number of the stories we want to see told, the control of those stories winds up being driven by money more than just the attempt to drive a good story. And we always know that, but I'm specifically talking about things like whether Spider-Man is going to stay in the MCU and the canceling of Netflix because of what Disney wants to do. And it's, in some ways I'm saying, boo capitalism bad. And it's not the most, sort of out there position I can take. And it's also, we need incredible budgets to make these stories, and maybe this is the price we pay. But I think there's a real ethical issue in the fact that we start, the fact that because of contract disputes, we're not going to get more of some of these great stories. And it does seem at this point now like that Spider-Man is going to stay in the MCU, at least sort of. But I think there's an ethical question behind the fact that we just don't have all of that coming up, and it's one that really makes me sad.
I agree, and it would be. I think that's a good topic for an episode because it's not going to stop being relevant, and it sort of ties in with one of the concerns that I have going forward in a later list here.
So it ties in very much to my number 3, which is also about the industry. And we covered it a lot in our Star Wars episode, so I won't go too in depth with it. But it's the degree to which stories are changed based on fan reaction. I am going to have real trouble believing that the role that some of the decisions that were made in making The Rise of Skywalker weren't in part because of the very angry backlash of a very vocal and very angry and pretty shitty part of the fan base. And so that's one that just really bothers me. And I know we just talked about that. Your number 3 was the Star Wars Force. I did report Star Wars. And yes, a great episode we did as well on the ethics of the Jedi and the Sith, the Force users.
Yeah. So this is the one we did with Jonah Kellman. And just, I like explaining, it actually served as a really good lead-in to our preview discussion for Rise of Skywalker, where we were talking about how, it's not just a dichotomy of Jedi good, Sith bad. And we Jonah and I revealed ourselves to be Sith sympathizers in many ways.
Yeah.
I don't sympathize with the murder of children, or the use of children as soldiers, or any of the Nazi garbage that the First Order was doing, nothing like that. But I think it is important to be critical of the Jedi for giving rise to Darth Vader and for their stupid puritanical nonsense that didn't affect anybody's ability to be in tune with the Force, obviously, or to control their feelings. It was a great discussion.
It really was, and I think in many ways that discussion is the best example of why I didn't like Rise of Skywalker more than I did. Because I think that discussion got into the very heart and soul of the ethics of Star Wars in a way that the later movies got away from.
I honestly don't think that Disney has the stomach to do that in a major motion picture for the franchise.
I mean, it did in Last Jedi, but it also may not have known that it was doing it.
Yeah, they did it, and it was really good, but then they didn't really do anything.
Anyway, so your number 2 is the Orville Prime Directive episode. Which, it was so good, and I'm so angry that we have to wait till the fall of this year to get Orville back,
and then
but
I have to buy into a service that I don't currently have. I'm going to, because the Orville is worth it. That is still the best Star Trek show to be made.
It's the best Star Trek show that's been made in the last 10 years.
I don't even know if Picard's going to surpass it. Patrick Stewart is a wonderful actor. He cannot, contrary to some fan belief, carry an entire show all on his own.
And spoilers, that's going to be on one of my later lists.
Right.
So,
But that episode about mad idolatry is the one I'm specifically talking about, where we talked about when Kelly was thought to be a religious figure on the planet, and the whole what a great episode of television that posed some challenging ethical questions and didn't answer them.
Yeah. And that is to me, it was Star Trek at its best, it's Marvel at its best, it's anything at its best.
And then we had something in season 2 that I really like. I don't think we've talked about it yet. The whole thing with the Mocklans actually shook out.
Oh, yeah.
Very real, very like good. They moved that story forward.
I'm going to do a brief plug, which is that I have another podcast called the Orville Universe Podcast, for which we do a episode by episode review of things. Jacob, we will definitely want to have you on as a guest sometime to that, because we get into these pretty deep into these questions. We have not yet done season 2, and we want to kind of as a lead-in to the season 3. And so I'd love to have you out as a guest when we bring that on.
Yeah.
I'm going to, because we are getting closer to destination, I'm going to quickly kind of yada through our last couple, because we've discussed all of them. But my number 2 was what happens to the people and to the society when superheroes exist. And Marvel, the MCU always covered it a little bit, but I was always frustrated that it didn't do more. And so I'd say The Boys and Umbrella Academy just raised those questions so well. And then my number 1, which I already talked about, is revenge versus fixing things. Yeah. And then Jacob's number 1, which we talked about somewhat, is problematic favorites.
Yeah. I knew it was high up on my list.
Yeah.
And I should have had more faith in myself that I put it in number 1.
Yeah. Well, and I put it on there too, and I think it's just so relevant to us as fans, you know?
And as critical fans, as fans that are willing to, and I don't mean this to be condescending or demeaning to anybody who consumes media who doesn't do this, but who are actively willing to seek out information that might make us question our choices about what we choose to consume, and challenge ourselves constantly with that, and each other with, like, how can you justify watching wrestling with garbage, blah blah.
And I know, looking ahead, something both you and I mentioned on other lists was things about, how do we apply more of these questions to our own lives? And I think the problematic favorites is a great part of that.
Yeah.
So things we're looking forward to in 2020. And I'm going to kind of do the 2 at a time. Number 5 on your list was the finale of Supernatural, and number 4 is what's next for the MCU. Right. So I want to quick just kind of touch on both of those.
So Supernatural is ending this year.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
I did.
They're having a definitive end. They're having a JRPG ending. They have to kill God. Like, I'm not joking.
I know.
I am so super duper in for this, because they're not doing it as a cheap, like, well, okay, God wasn't what we thought God was, a little bit, but they're not doing the, well, if we just have the right powers and we have the right stuff, then we can do it. They're really wrestling with the, like, did our lives mean anything when someone was, like, literally, like, writing the script for them this whole time?
So they're doing Theodicy?
It's so hand-wringing, and I love it.
I don't think I can make myself watch it from a main episode summary so we can get into it, because what you're telling me is it's going to be a season of theology, and that is
It's not quite.
Well, I should say
there is a determinism versus free will sub-theme running throughout.
It will be ethical questions that I have a theological approach to. Sure. Maybe a better way to put it.
Yes,
and it seems like maybe part of the discussion is going to be, should there be a theological approach to? And with your number 4, it shows maybe a little bit of our different perspectives. I have the same question basically on one of my concerns. But yeah, right. I mean, it is a huge move. The Netflix MCU especially has been a huge part of this podcast. Yeah. And as well as the entire MCU saga that ended with Endgame has been a huge part of just, the entire story. And I think I'm really curious as well. My number 5 is video games. I've really gotten hooked. Part of it started with watching my partner play games like Dragon Age, where just the character development is so good. I then played with her, with us switching the controller back and forth, Final Fantasy 15, and I would just, 4 emo boys on a road trip I never thought I would care about quite so much, but damn, that's a good story. And my number 4 is of the Picard and a return to the Star Trek canon. And we joke all the time that I think the Orville is the best of the current Star Trek properties. I think it is truer to Star Trek than either the Discovery show, though I've heard that's gotten a lot better in more recent seasons. I think it is much truer to J.J. Abrams. J.J. Abrams to me is true to the Wrath of Khan, but it has nothing to do with the rest of the Star Trek universe. And so I'm really hopeful that Picard will bring us back to that. I'm both concerned about it, but also hopeful. I know you mentioned that as well.
Yes.
My number 3 and 2, just kind of continuing, The Boys Season 2. I've talked about it already, but The Boys Season 1 had, no spoilers, but it had a couple of, not even cliffhangers, but it was, oh, hey, you think you've understood the ethical questions? Actually, here's a huge reveal that just tilts everything. And I can't wait to see how they explore it. And as we already talked about, Orville Season 2.
Mm-hmm.
Your 3 and 2 were talking about video games, which just got into, and the AEW Women's Division. So say a bit about that.
So first, video games, because it's higher on my list because I've been waiting for this for a while. There's something I want that comes up later where I really want to talk about it.
Uh-huh.
And I think we're at a point where we can on the podcast. We'll get more into that later. AEW Women's Division, just as briefly as I'm capable of, which is not very long-winded.
I'll interrupt you. Don't worry about it.
But they have done a good job of making a good alternative product, except they started from a position where they were behind with their women's division. They hadn't had everybody they wanted. They didn't have enough people signed. They didn't have stories in place. And it's been a constant criticism that people have had of the show that they only have one match per weekly show, compared to the competing product on a similar night, and NXT is 2. And it's like the women should be able to have close to an equal space on the card, and they currently don't. And I am looking forward to, they have a whole another year now to do this.
Oh, great.
And, well, for me, before I'm all like, you have to either say you're not doing it at all, or you have to, you can't half-ass this.
Shit or get off the pot.
Yeah, shit or get off the pot.
And my biggest question is, have they avoided the sexualization of the women wrestlers to the extent that WWE has done so badly?
For the most part, there's one performer. She is a wrestler. She has wrestled in the ring prior to this point. Whose now character gimmick seems to be that she's the sexy eye candy hanging on another character, but it's weird because it doesn't feel the same way that WWE does it. Because what she's doing is she's using the fact that the promotion itself is very squeamish about intergender wrestling. Am I lifting here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well,
about intergender wrestling to mess with his opponents
right,
and help get him wins. And then also using she's not using her sex appeal, I feel, in a way that is objectifying, but in a way that is it's her choice and empowering for her. I think.
Yeah.
But
we got to see how it plays out. But that
exactly.
sounds, sexuality is a part of it, and certainly they very objectify the male wrestlers. And it's,
right.
I know that was the WWE though did it in ways that felt really sleazy, and so if they're approaching it, that makes me interested. I'll say quickly, my number 1 was The Mandalorian Season 2, which I think I've kind of gone into, and I won't go too more into. But I have a very big question, which is, I want to understand what is your ethical concern about your number 1? Because Jacob's number 1 thing to look forward to is my getting married. And so, what is the ethical question here?
So, I just wanted to put it on the podcast because I'm very excited about it, and
I appreciate that.
So and honestly, I was having trouble coming up with a fit thing that I really felt like deserved that level of attention.
That's fair.
But I do think it's maybe not relevant from an ethical consideration, but is relevant for the podcast in that there might be some interruptions that are unusual / bonus episodes, depending, because one thing that's going to happen is that all 3 people who have served as a host on this podcast are going to be in the same physical space at the same time.
I think that may well happen. I'm really looking forward to you and Paul meeting.
But there may be an ethical concern of how much is too much to troll the guy who's going to get married, because I think Paul and I might do a fair amount of that.
Well, and I will say that, and there is one other ethical thing that I think is kind of relevant to our discussions, which is, for those who don't know us, I asked Jacob to be my best man, and he's helping me plan a bachelor party. And the first time I got married, I did none of that stuff, because to me, anything involving men getting together to celebrate anything, just by definition, reeked of toxic masculinity. And since then, that makes it sound like I'm now pro-toxic masculinity. I'm actually not.
Since then, I've come around to toxic masculinity.
Since then, in part because of the friendships I've made with you and a lot of the other male magic judges who I know, who are all very aware of these issues as well, I've really changed a lot in my ability to kind of redefine what masculinity, what celebrating masculinity and male friendship can be like in ways that aren't toxic. And so I actually do think it's kind of awesome that you and I are going to get to share that experience. So I can find an ethical consideration in anything, so there we go.
Right, it's reinforcing positive male friendship and celebrating what is positive to be celebrated about in masculinity, rather than the traditional get drunk and go get strippers or whatever.
Yeah. And for any who are curious, we're not going to have any strippers at my bachelor party, mostly because my partner would really object that she wasn't getting to enjoy them as well. So now moving on to just all I should mention, my honorable mentions for the ethical questions. My things I'm looking forward to are Falcon and the Winter Soldier, just because those were always kind of second-tier characters, and I really want to see what happens, as well as having a black character. I'm excited about Birds of Prey, which I'm both excited and concerned about, and I'll talk more about in a moment, and The Witcher. Again, it's just something I'm getting at both ends, because I started it in 2019, but I'm really excited for it's going to go 2020.
Right.
Let's move to our next question, which is the 5 concerns we have in 2020. And Jacob, your top 2 were, I'm going to have to switch Jacob's page. Actually, you hadn't filled them in yet, so what do you say is your number 4?
Oh, Mulan, but not for the reasons that you think.
Okay.
Or maybe for the reasons that you think.
Because I have reasons to be concerned about it. I wonder if we have the same ones.
All of the trailers look pretty good, actually. The Song of Mulan is a very important story in Chinese culture.
Yeah.
In traditional Chinese culture, as I understand it, and understand I'm coming from a position of an outsider, but I am seeing a all Asian so far cast that I was seeing in the trailers. My concern comes from The Last Jedi type position where I'm concerned about fan backlash. I'm concerned that we're going to have a really wonderful thing in a non-whitewashed cast of a story that shouldn't have any white actors in it because there's no white characters in it, and people are going to set Disney on fire for it.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And attack the actors and actresses and the people involved in the film. And I'm just really excited to see that story told. Like, I finally got to see Crazy Rich Asians this year, and I want more movies with casts like that where we can acknowledge the fact that you don't have to be a big name Caucasian to have a good movie, or you don't need one to have a good movie.
I mean, I think Black Panther. I don't want to say that we should ask for like an Asian Black Panther and an Asian Luke Cage, because I think that's a false equivalency.
Right.
But certainly those properties show us how important it is to not have the story of an Asian character in a white world, but to have the world that's different. It's interesting because Mulan, I thought about actually putting on my list of concerns, but for a very different reason. And I'm going to say from the beginning, this is an issue that I'm very aware that I do not understand, and I'm only concerned because of what I've read about the concern of others, and I plan to educate myself a lot on this topic. And if people have things they want to send in, especially if you have a perspective that's more aware of it, please let me know. And that's I've read a lot of concerns from people of Chinese descent, but who are not connected to the People's Republic of China, either Taiwanese or now a number of Hong Kong folk, who are concerned that this is really going to be a celebration of Chinese nationalism.
Right.
Again, I don't feel comfortable commenting either way, and frankly, I don't think I would do an episode on it because of that. But it's something I'm aware of, and that I want to kind of read more about, especially because and we've talked about this before, and I think it's going to come up a little later. There's this unfortunate thing that is a number of Hollywood studios have gone on record as saying that there are some issues that they don't cover because of their concerns about how they will play in the Chinese market. For example, Doctor Strange not having the Ancient One be Tibetan because of the relationship between China and Tibet. And so I don't know how much those concerns have played into this. And again, it's one I don't know about. But yeah, so for me, Mulan is definitely one I'm thinking about. My number 5, as I brought up before, is Birds of Prey. I think this is going to be a very good movie. I hope so. There's a lot of things that were terrible about Suicide Squad. I loved Harley Quinn in it. I hated how sexualized she was. And my understanding is that the actress has said that part of why this movie is really about her emancipation is no more abusive love story with Joker. No more, she's a very sexual character, and that's great. But it's much more going to be on her own terms. So I have that concern, and I have a concern about how much is going to be her movie, and the other two are going to be sidekicks. I'm hoping those things aren't going to be there, but I really have concerns about them. And you can respond to that one as well as the other thing I'll say is my number 4 is studios caving to angry fans. More Rise of Skywalker stuff.
I think that was if it wasn't on my list of concerns, it should have been.
Yeah.
It's sort of like it ties into the Mulan thing, but as a more broad category of, like, again, it's okay.
Yeah, it actually is your number 2.
Yeah, okay. It's okay for fans to be critical of creators and for creators to respond to that, but it has to be for the right reasons. It has to be because they fucked up, right? Not because, we did do good, but it's not selling well, or we made a bunch of people, and like, I think that artists and media producers have an obligation to help move the culture forward.
Yeah.
And if you deny that obligation in favor of the almighty dollar, then you are selling out, and you should be taken to task for it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. There's a great phrase that I learned in seminary as a watchword for pastors, and I think it's true though for a lot of anyone who's kind of like a justice advocate. But I think also therefore I hold art to the same standard, which is that you should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I feel like saying we're sorry, saying we're gonna have a movie that we've listened to minority groups saying there's not enough representation, so we're going to do that. Great way to listen. Listening to white people saying they don't like being challenged on their own racism, that to me is a bad time to move forward. So I'm with you there. So your number 3 is about the election cycle, and I actually have a similar one, but you want to kind of give your version of it and we'll see how much it's...
So in the U.S., we have a very important election coming up in 2020, and first of all, regardless of your political views, I want to encourage everybody to engage with the dialogue, engage with the candidates you're thinking about voting for, and vote.
Superheroes vote.
Vote.
Yep.
One of the most heroic things that you can do in our society, in my opinion, is participate in the goddamn participatory democracy.
Yeah.
It doesn't work if you don't do it.
And it sounds like that's at the heart of your concern, is that kind of like people being beaten down too much and not participating.
Exactly. There's a lot of fire in people after Trump got elected, and then the midterms happened, and it wasn't quite enough to turn the tide.
Yep.
And really give Trump enough of a challenge. And so my big concern is that the people who are like-minded to myself, I understand my own biases are at play here, have been beaten down to the point where they're thinking they may as well not hear or not engage because they're not going to win anyway.
Yeah. And I have a very real concern about that, and tying it a little more to our topics, I have a concern that fans are going to want media to be more escapist.
Yes.
There's a cartoon that was going around a while ago, and actually one of the first things I ever wrote for the Superhero FX blog before it became a podcast, that there's a cartoon about someone who kind of goes out into the world, and it's people yelling at each other, and it's all these social issues. And the response is, that he just wants to go hide in his escapist world of media. And I hate that cartoon because it's presented as this is a great thing that fandom does. And I shouldn't say I hate it, but my response is that what I want is fandom to be a safe place from all that feeling, but also a place that eventually makes you feel like I can't just stay in the safe cocoon. I need to go be a hero, and I need to go and fix it. And I think that's a concern we both share. So, deal with the concerns. My number 3 concern we already talked about is that Picard won't feel like Star Trek. J.J. Abrams may become my Zack Snyder in 2020. I hate what he did to Star Trek. I hate what he did to Star Wars. So that's my number 3 concern. And then my number 2 is pretty much what you said. It's that politics making geeks want escapism.
Rather than engaging.
Yeah. And then your number 2 is about the kind of similar stuff about stories being more affected by the desire for profits and the Chinese market and the fanboys and stuff like that.
Yeah, particularly this ties into something that we are both very heavily connected with, like in the Magic story, and a character who was pretty explicitly bi. That part of her character got erased in a piece of officially published fiction for no fucking reason whatsoever that I could think of, except to appease the Chinese market, which is a bad reason.
Well, and there I want to push back, because I was going to say, actually, one of my biggest concerns of myself and of all of us is, and here's where I don't know where reality meets concern, which is, like, I think you're right. I think Wizards is on record as talking about wanting to sell to the Chinese market and concerned about how stories like that will play in. But I also know there's a real danger of ourselves, as well as people like Wizards. Like, there's a lot of people in America who might not like, who might be homophobic about these stories as well.
Sure.
And I do think that I have a personal concern that I think the blame China thing can become a little racist if we're not careful.
Right. No, absolutely.
And it's one I think I want to hold us, but I think you as well. I want to kind of challenge us both to hold us accountable to that, because we're on record that we know that is a concern. And I don't think it's about the Chinese people. I think it's about the Chinese government.
I want to thank you. Thank you very much. I want to be very clear. It is about the government. It's about the decisions, about the restriction of media and information to their nation. There's a lot of yeah.
And so your number 1, I didn't put on here, but maybe I should have. It certainly is one I'm thinking about a lot. But I want to give you a second to talk about it. Certainly it sounds a lot more important than my number 5, my number 1, which is the popularity and award winningness of Joker and what that's going to do to the industry.
This should be an entire episode of the podcast, honestly, but
just
Cliff's Notes version. Joker won a Golden Globe, and it's probably going to win some other awards, and a lot of people laud it as something that appropriately challenges woke culture.
Yep.
Using that exact terminology, and I just want to kick that entire statement in the nuts until dead, because it's a very violent thing for me to say. I understand I'm a pacifist, so
but
what I mean is that the idea that somehow wanting to be aware of and empathize with people that aren't like us and be cognizant of it and respect other people when they voice that they're upset or concerned or triggered by things, that would ever be a bad thing is bullshit.
Yeah. And the thing is, I think that probably woke culture could use some critique. I think anything could use some critique. But I don't want to see it critiqued by a movie that says we should have sympathy for a disaffected, lonely white guy who doesn't get enough attention and respect and thus turns to violence to act out on his problems.
Right.
That's a real thing in our culture that I don't think needs sympathy right now. And I think there's a way to have told that. And I'll admit, I haven't seen Joker yet. I need to. I'm going just on all the mostly I'm reacting to the fan reaction, but the fan reaction terrifies me.
Same.
And I think that's the so mine now much less.
One last thing. I feel like the movie The Joker, what it should have done was challenge people by making a story about a very disturbing person, and trying to make them sympathetic, and that's what we should be struggling. That's why it should be a good movie, right? Is that we're struggling with feeling any amount of sympathy for this person, and that's not what it's being held up as.
Right.
As in that
Because
bothers me.
if you want to say that disaffected white guys get kicked around too much by woke culture, I'm going to somewhat push back, but I'm going to say, okay, there might be a movie that could explore that. I don't think this was the way to do that.
Sure.
Especially because, frankly, we get it. Like, Punisher was already way too much of it. So my last concern, again, it seems a little trite, but I do think it's important, is... Actually, I can make it sound more important, because I think it is. I think that we talked about it way too much, I know, but I think that the Netflix Marvel universe was the pinnacle of really pushing ethical questions in superhero media. And to me, I always think about the fact that, like, Captain America can kill people and not feel guilty. Daredevil clearly, like, felt guilt about all... I don't think he ever, like... Well, he never killed people, he just hit them in the head with iron pipes. But, like, Netflix Marvel wrestled with the ethical questions of superhero stuff in ways that I know comic books had, but that I've never really seen on television do. And now more things are doing it, like The Boys and Umbrella Academy, and even Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. started to do. I am worried that we will lose that when Disney takes over those stories.
And they'll become way too safe.
Yeah. And Return of Skywalker really makes me a lot more worried about that. Mandalorian doesn't, because Mandalorian, frankly, is much darker than any Star Wars property I've ever seen. There's blood in, so...
It's very interesting to hear you talk that way about it. I wasn't joking last episode where I said I was subscribing to Becky and Rachel Judge things. I listened to their episode on The Mandalorian, and they have a radically different take.
Interesting.
They don't like it.
Okay.
They don't like it. We'll talk about it later.
I would definitely enjoy listening to it, because, yeah, I greatly appreciate... I don't know Rachel, but Rachel is the sister of Becky Allen, who's been on our podcast a number of times, and I really love both their perspectives.
Plug for Becky and Rachel Judge things. Like, seriously, it's really good, and I love that it gives me two people criticizing media that are voices that I don't have from perspectives that I don't have. I love it.
It is very good, and it doesn't just do sort of geek media. Among other things, it did an episode of The Christmas Prince that is wonderful.
Yeah, very good.
But that also gave me, like, a perspective on the rom-com that I would not have gotten.
Yep.
So I'm just going to read through all 5 of my 5 things we wish we were talking about more of. So my honorable mentions for concerns were Joker style. We're the Joker. And also, we have a Batman movie coming up. And Batman is always going to be my favorite hero.
We have a Batman movie coming out?
Yeah, the Batman movie I think is coming out in 2020. Maybe I misread it, but I think it's coming out this year.
No, I'm just criticizing DC for poor promotion. I have no idea where the Batman movie coming.
It may be 2021, and all our fans are now going to write in. But so let me just quickly go through my top 5 things I wish we talked about more of, and then if you want to comment a little, and then we'll read your 5.
Yeah.
But mine were number 5, the business of media. We talked about that a good deal already.
Yeah.
Number 4 is connecting these questions to our own lives. I think it's always kind of implicit, but I'd like to be a little more explicit, and I will give a shout out here to a wonderful not podcast, but a blog. I think it might actually be a podcast. I'm embarrassed I've not interacted with this in 2 years, but it's the Be Super Project. And it's run by a person who was a guest a long time ago. I'd love to get her back on. But it really goes into saying, how can we take the lessons of superheroes and actually, like, they do things like go into high schools and, like, teach kids, what can Superman teach you about how to be a better person? I would love it if we did a little bit more of that in our own podcasting.
I can't tell if that's the exit I need or not.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit further on. It's going to be the next one, though. So my number 3 is She-Ra.
It was that.
Oh, okay. There's a weird divider. Yeah,
it was a weird divider. Sorry, folks.
It means we get a few more minutes. So, so number 3 is She-Ra. Because again, it's a kids show, and it's a completely female-driven show, and it's a perspective, therefore, that you don't get as much. And it really just is doing mind-blowing things with animation and with storytelling. And I really wish we would talk about it some more in the next year. Apparently, I really liked it because I have She-Ra as number 3 and number 2. So perhaps the thing I want to do is more editing in 2020. But I will slip in Cloak and Dagger and The Runaways. And those are the 2 sort of MCU, but definitely Marvel shows that happen on TV outside of Netflix. And they're both kind of YA shows, but they're really, really good, and they raise some great issues. And then my number one that we talked about is Umbrella Academy and The Boys. So yeah, a lot of it's just kind of more like the independent media, and I mean, of course, we haven't talked about it because there's just so much now. Like 2 years ago, I prided myself on the fact that I saw every superhero product on television. I just can't anymore. And that's connected also to my honorable mentions, which is Black Lightning and the Arrowverse. Both of which I know are continuing to do interesting things. The Arrowverse is kind of cheesy in its storytelling, but has some good storytelling. Black Lightning, I think, is actually just a very good show that I wish had gotten more attention. But yeah, so that's my list. And kind of let me hear your thoughts on that. We can discuss it for a minute, and then I'll hear your 5.
I mean, that is a lot of stuff that I haven't watched that you want to talk about.
Yeah.
But I want to be clear, if it doesn't look like I'm going to get to something within the next year or so, most likely I'm not going to remember a lot of what you spoil me on.
Yeah.
And I'm 100% okay having a podcast discussion. Because I'm going to be pitching some for things that you haven't seen.
Yeah.
And like, I'm willing to sit here and be like sort of I'm not aware of this, but I'm willing to learn and just engage with the core topic underneath that you want to focus on.
Well, and I think that's important because I do think a bit of a self-critique that I have is I think when we started this podcast and also when you came on it, we had a very clear focus of let's explore the ethical question in this property in a way that someone who hasn't seen the property would still enjoy and appreciate and get something out of. I think more recently we've slid a little bit more into doing property reviews. Certainly, I don't fault us because it was very important and also is so full of ethical issues. But our last episode was 100% a movie review about Rise of Skywalker.
We talked about talking about an ethical
Yeah.
question. we did talk about ethical questions with respect to representations of the movie.
Yeah.
And problems with adjusting media. We did those.
Right.
But
so my point is, I think it'd actually be good to do some episodes where one of us hasn't seen the property because
Yeah.
it'll help pull us away from that. And as well as, your schedule is getting busier, so we may have some episodes that you can't be on, and that'll be good times to do things you haven't seen but want to. Yeah, and so let's, your top 5, your number 5 is C-3PO in The Rise of Skywalker, which...
That is the one I was alluding to, but we
Yep.
lampshaded that question in the podcast about Rise of Skywalker. We just never circled back to his sacrifice, which I take that personally. I own that. That's on me. I am the person who bangs that drum. So.
And we are going to do probably 1, if not 2 episodes on the ethics of artificial intelligence, because my partner's father, who actually does a lot of work in building artificial intelligence robots, he I know wants to do an episode with us where he defends the robots in The Matrix and Terminator, which I'm very excited for. But also because it's going to come up in Picard, it's going to come up in a lot of the stuff we're looking at. We are definitely... What was that?
We need gas.
Oh, yeah. We have enough to get there, though. We're definitely going to be... a good ethical question. Who pays for gas on a road trip? But we're definitely going to do a few episodes on artificial intelligence. And so fans help hold us accountable. We will make sure we talk about C-3PO's sacrifice, because not only is it a great ethical question in that movie, Rise of Skywalker, but it brings up the fact that the ethical value of droids is never explored in any other part of the Star Wars properties except the Clone Wars TV show. Never in the main movies. So your number 4 is practicing ethics, and I think is that pretty much kind of the stuff we've talked about already?
I was going to say, I thought that was on my list too. It's exactly what you were talking about earlier, about talking more about things like the Being Super Project, about
right.
It ties in with one of my concerns with the election and politics in the U.S. in 2020.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to do a section in that episode. I'm a very politically involved person, and I think it's very hard for people to figure out how to get politically involved if they want to. Especially for a lot of us are introverts, and the last thing you want to do is talk to strangers. And the fact is, there's a lot of things you can do to help political campaigns of any campaign. I'm not going to make that partisan, though you all know where I stand. But there's a lot of things you can do, and so we will do partially an episode on that. Number 3 is Persona 5, and I watched my partner Mary play through some of this, so I agree with you. But you want to give us just 20 seconds on why that's a good one to explore?
Persona 5 is a video game with a story that explores a radical ethical problem within the first 3 hours of gameplay, which for a video game that's like staggeringly soon to be challenging the and it keeps doing it. This is a scenario where the lead characters have the power to take people who are being shitty and like actively rewrite them basically to stop being shitty and to own their shittiness. And then do it.
Wow.
And do it multiple times. And then there's this whole thing about whether or not these people are doing good or are actually themselves villains. And it's something I really want to deep dive into by talking about the nuances and different events. So I'm not going to go super deep on it now yet. We're just turning around.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to explore that, and I also want to. I realized I never actually mentioned why it is I'm so excited to explore ethics in video games. And part of it, and maybe Persona 5 doesn't quite let you do this, because it sounds like it is predetermined that what the characters do, at least in that regard. But one of the things that this podcast started with people watching movies and TV shows and saying, I don't know if I would have done what Captain America did. Maybe I would have done something different. And what has blown me away about video games is now I get to make that choice. And in a way, it is kind of a choose-your-own ethical adventure. Like the game Destiny that I'm playing, there are distinctly two different ethical sides, and you kind of pick which one you think is right. Yeah. In the same kind of way like Skyrim. Like, you can be there's a civil war happening, and neither one is clearly, like, in the right. Like, they're both... And I really want to get it... To me, we'll probably do a couple episodes on video games, but the one that I would really want to do is how does it change the media when you get to be an active participant?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I actually I pitched that same one as something that we might have recorded today in the car.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, I'm in. I think that's a great discussion. There's been a lot of games where there's morality systems that give you choices and it changes your character's arc.
Yep.
Some of them more nuanced and some of them more anvily. The more nuanced ones are the ones that I enjoy the most because they're the ones that recognize that it's not always black or white clear what the right decision is.
And so your number 2 was, by the way, if anyone is interested in the fact that we are now back to reading each one and talking about them instead of what we did with mine of reading all 5, it's because Jacob did something very smart, which is right before we were going to have to discuss all 5 of his on like 2 minutes. He took a wrong turn, which added 10 minutes to our drive. So, good.
Buying myself time to talk more.
Strategic podcasting is a thing. But yeah, so number 2 is the Flubs and the Magic storyline. And so why do you think this is an important one?
Well, it's because we've talked about the Magic storyline before as an episode, and there's a recent development that is something I think deservedly so, need to be very critical of, and I would feel that we would be doing a disservice to our listeners and the people we interact with, not bringing it on the podcast as a major topic.
Yeah.
Because it concerns representation, it concerns dealing with alternative sexualities in characters in a different form of media, and like the fact that as a entity, Wizards can't get celebrated for doing something progressive and then just throw it in the garbage later. They can't have it both ways.
And I think it's a very good episode, especially because, and maybe this is not the direction you want to go, but maybe I can convince, or maybe this already is, I feel like there's 2 other reasons why Magic especially is a really good topic for us to explore.
Well, there's a show coming.
Well, yeah, there's a TV show coming, but also, let's get personal. You and I make money, or at least we do. I mean, Jacob.
We make money.
Yeah,
we make money. No bones about it. We make money off of Magic.
Jacob and I are right now driving to an event where we will work helping to run a Magic event. And so it hits home on a very personal level, because I certainly have thought about what is the line of how bad they can go before I have to decide I can't do that anymore. And so it makes the personal favorites question really come home for both of us. But also it happens because the Magic thing is a little bit interesting in that it gets into problematic issues from kind of a degree of separation, because what Jacob and I are doing is going to judge people playing a game. And there's a story that undergirds the game, and that just Jacob and I are saying has had some real problems. But you also don't have to know anything about the story to play and interact with the game. And I think that raises some questions. Like, I don't think that lets us off the hook.
Right.
but I think it raises a lot of questions of, to me, if this was I think we would have gotten to the point of, if we were just watching Magic TV show, I probably would have stopped watching. I'm still wrestling with how much can I be involved in something where my involvement isn't with the story, it's with the game, but the story is very tied into the game, And I think that I imagine that episode is going to involve a lot of soul searching by both of us, because it's going to be, and it may well be that one of us convinces the other to change something. I don't know, but I think you're right. That's a very, very good concern to bring up. And so the last one you had, as you want to talk about more, was disposable people. Let's go into this, because I think this is going to be a really good one.
We talked about this topic before, but I think it deserves a revisit because it keeps happening. This is the who can we kill discussion, but I kind of want to expand it. And this kind of ties into the 3PO thing as well.
Yeah.
It's this idea of, just because his memory can get overwritten or potentially restored doesn't make his sacrifice any less, or the fact that he has to make that choice any less. And especially since the principal villain of Picard, starting off, looks like it's going to be, at least in part, dealing with the Borg. The Borg are a very firm example of disposable people.
Yeah.
In terms of, it's okay to kill them because they're all, this homogenous, hive mind collective thing. And, no.
Yeah.
That's still life, and it's still intelligent life.
Well, I think this is a great topic, because we can approach it from the who can you kill, which is a very good point of view. We can approach it from whose sacrifice matters. And I think we can approach it from whose issues are taken seriously,
right,
and whose are comic relief.
And whose are played for laughs.
And in some ways, that's, I think, what's most revolutionary about C-3PO is the entire rest of the movie, he's comic relief. And the entire rest of the saga, he's comic relief. We're turning right here.
What's this one?
So I think that's going to be one. In some ways, that's one we've danced around a lot in all of the podcasts. But I think it'd be really good to explore it a much more, and maybe the framework I would offer for it, especially because it comes up so often in video games. You're going 7/10 of a mile now.
Yes.
These are very rainy, ugly roads, so that's why we're having some trouble.
Yeah.
Jacob is doing
I cannot see lines at all.
Yeah, I could not drive and podcast, so Jacob's doing a phenomenal job here.
Are we here or no, we're farther?
Yeah, about half a mile more. Okay. I say the framework that I might suggest we approach that with, especially because it ties into so much about video games, is who gets to be a PC versus who gets to be an NPC.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I dig that.
And I think there's a great way we can connect it, because, that's a comment I've been making a lot more when I look at, the way people treat other people on the internet.
Yes.
I think a lot of it's who do you see as an NPC? And it's
and that's dehumanizing in and of itself, but people do it all the time. And I'm not saying that people are monsters or doing it on purpose, but
it's a thing.
When you don't know somebody, it's a lot easier to treat them as not a person.
And it ties into, I think I've said this before, but one of my favorite sort of phrases of classical philosophy, or maybe not classical, but the last 300 years, comes from a Jewish philosopher and theologian named Martin Buber, where he talked about the importance of the difference between an I-I relationship versus an I-thou relationship. Or an I-thou versus an I-it relationship. And it's how much are you recognizing the humanity of the other person you're interacting with? So, I think that'll be a great topic. We're now almost to our destination, so Jacob, any kind of final thoughts you want to add, or things we didn't mention?
That was my last one.
That was your number one, yep.
We did it, just these, I'm actually curious how much people like these top 5 episodes, so if you're interested in contributing your own top 5s along these topics or others for the year, I'm interested in hearing about that. Posting that on Facebook for us to review, and we might even do a review of that. I know, Matthew, we're talking about potentially for next year, farther down the road, engaging and getting a voting thing for some of this to talk about. Because I'm not gonna lie, I like the idea of talking about things that people who listen to us want us to talk about.
Yep.
But I don't know what that is, so we just sort of pick a topic and go these days.
And that's a bit of a plug. This is the point in time where Jacob and I are starting to plot out what are the topics we want to cover for next year.
Yeah.
And one thing I actually want to be more intentional of is, a lot of times it's, oh, hey, I just saw this great movie. Did you see that movie? Yeah, let's talk about that for our next episode.
Right.
And I'm actually going to try and be intentional of looking ahead to what is the release schedule and what are the things we both want to plan to watch, and and do an episode on, or maybe if Jacob doesn't watch it or I don't watch it, the other one can still do it. But for you fans, I really want to give you a chance to have some input there. So please, if any of the topics we mentioned or things we're excited about, you're excited about as well, let us know. If any of them are ones we're like, wow, that sounds boring, don't do that episode, do this one instead, let us know. Anything you can think of, please let us know. And I'll use that to segue into our closing. The best way to let us know, as Jacob said, we have a Facebook group. We have a Facebook page as well with a group. You have to join it, but you will automatically be added. If you have a swastika as your profile picture, probably not. No, definitely not. But everyone else, you're going to be added. Join that group. You can also email us on Facebook. You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. The Facebook group is just called Superhero Ethics. You can also leave a comment on our page. You can tweet at us, Superhero Ethics at Twitter. Or you can just contact us directly. You can send us an email. Superheroethics@gmail.com, or find us either of us on Twitter.
You can DM me on Twitter. Bots are people too.
Yep, he's Bots for People too. I'm Superhero Ethicist. All of that will be in our podcast notes. Please support us on, give us a 5-star review. It's a great way to help other people listen, get more people into the conversation. You can support us on Patreon or buy some of our merchandise. All that information is on the website and on the notes. But since I now see our destination,